The golden throne screamed. 10,000 years of accumulated power tore through circuits that were never designed to contain such force. Tech priests died where they stood as the machines they had worshipped turned against them. Custodes were thrown back by waves of psychic energy that would have killed any normal human instantly. The chamber that had held the Emperor for millennia became a storm of golden fire. At the center of it all, the Emperor rose. His body was no longer the withered corpse that had sat upon the throne. Flesh knit together across ancient bones. Muscles formed where there had been nothing but dust. His face took shape, neither young nor old, but eternal. His eyes opened, and they held the light of stars. That he stood for the first time in 10,000 years. The cables and tubes that had connected him to the throne fell away like dead leaves. The machines that had sustained him went dark, no longer needed. He took a step forward, then another, moving with the grace of a god who had forgotten what walking felt like. The custodes who still stood knelt immediately. Tribune Valorous pressed his forehead to the ground and spoke the words that every custodes knew by heart. My lord. We have waited. We have served. We have never lost faith. The Emperor looked down at his guardian with eyes that saw everything. He saw Valoris's entire life in that moment. He saw every battle fought, every sacrifice made, every doubt suppressed. He saw 10,000 years of loyalty compressed into a single soul. And he spoke. His voice was not loud. It did not need to be. It entered the minds of everyone in the chamber, everyone in the palace, everyone on Terra, everyone in the Sol system. It spread outward at the speed of thought, carried by the Astronomicon that was no longer just a beacon but an extension of his will. Every human in the galaxy heard the Emperor speak. I have returned. 3 words. 3 simple words that changed everything. On hive worlds across the Imperium, people wept with joy. In the trenches of 1,000 battlefields, soldiers found new strength. In the depths of chaos, demons howled with fear. The Emperor had spoken, and the galaxy would never be the same, but there was more. The Emperor walked to the breach beneath his throne, the wound in reality that had been growing for 10,000 years. Demons pressed against the barrier, sensing that their moment had come. If the breach opened fully, Terra would become another eye of terror. Humanity's homeworld would be swallowed by the warp. The Emperor raised his hand. The gesture was simple, almost casual. But the power behind it was beyond measurement. Golden light poured from his palm and struck the breach like a hammer striking glass. The demons screamed. The barrier held. And then, slowly, impossibly, the breach began to close. That it took only moments. A wound that had threatened the Imperium for millennia was sealed by a being who had just awakened from 10,000 years of living death. The demons were banished. The warp was pushed back. Terra was saved from corruption, but salvation came with understanding. The Emperor turned his gaze outward, seeing the galaxy he had tried to save. And what he saw broke something inside him. The Imperium he had built was gone. In its place was a theocracy of suffering and ignorance. The truths he had fought to teach were forgotten. The science he had championed was called heresy. Humans prayed to him as a god, the very thing he had always forbidden. Everything he had worked for was dust. That he saw his sons gathering. The loyal ones burned with devotion he had never wanted. The traitors plotted against him with hatred he had helped create. He had failed them all. He had failed everyone. The weight of that failure settled on shoulders that were strong enough to carry worlds but still felt the burden. The forces converging on Terra sensed the change. The orcs hesitated in their advance. The Tyranids paused their consumption. The Necrons watched with ancient patience. Everyone waited to see what the Emperor would do next. As he walked through the palace, through chambers that had become shrines to his suffering. He saw the murals depicting his conquest of the galaxy. He saw the statues celebrating his divine nature. He saw the madness that faith had created in his name. And he wept. Golden tears fell from eyes that had seen the birth and death of stars. Each tear burned with psychic power. Where they struck the ground, flowers grew from dead stone. The Emperor of mankind, the being who had denied his own divinity for 30,000 years, finally accepted what he had become, that he was a god now. Not because he wanted to be. Not because it was right. But because humanity needed him to be. Their faith had made him what he was. Their suffering had paid for his return. He could not reject their gift, even if it meant becoming the thing he hated most. The emperor reached the great gates of the palace and threw them open. Outside, billions of defenders waited. Beyond them, enemies gathered in numbers beyond counting. Above, the void burned with the fires of 1,000 ships. This was the moment that would decide everything. That he raised his voice again, speaking to every soul who could hear. I have seen what my Imperium has become. I have seen the darkness and the light. I have seen my failures and my triumphs. And I have seen you. The armies waited. Friends and enemies alike hung on his every word. You have fought in my name for 10,000 years. You have suffered for me. You have died for me. You have given everything for an emperor who could not help you. And now I stand before you, reborn in the faith you kept alive. His light grew brighter, spreading across Terra like a second sun. The question is not whether I can save you. The question is whether you will let me. Salvation will require sacrifice. Victory will require change. The Imperium you know must die so that humanity can live. He looked at the enemies gathered against him. Orcs and Tyranids and Necrons and more. He looked at the warp, where the Chaos Gods watched with fear and hatred. He looked at his sons, both loyal and traitor, waiting to see what their father would do. The war begins now. Choose your side. And pray that you choose wisely. The Emperor stepped forward, and the galaxy trembled. The final battle for humanity's soul had begun. Whatever happened next, nothing would ever be the same. The God Emperor walked among mortals once more, and the universe itself held its breath. The golden light from Terra had become a beacon that no power in the galaxy could ignore. Ships from every faction were converging on the Sol system. The Imperium's defenders watched their instruments with growing horror as the numbers kept climbing. This would not be a battle. This would be the end of everything or the beginning of something new. The orcs came first. They always did. Warboss Gazkul Thraka had united more greenskins than any orc in history. His Waak had been moving through the galaxy like a green tide, destroying everything in its path. But now it had a new target. The biggest fight was coming. The best fight. The fight that would make all other fights look like games. Terra would burn green, or Gazkul would die trying. His ships tore through the warp with brutal efficiency. Orc technology should not have worked as well as it did, but the greenskins believed it would work, and so it did. Millions of orcs crammed into vessels held together by faith and enthusiasm. They sang war songs that could be heard across the void. They sharpened their chop-pa and loaded their shuddas. This was what they lived for. This was what they were born to do. Behind the orcs came the Tyranids. Hive Fleet Leviathan had been the largest Tyranid incursion ever recorded. It had nearly consumed several sectors before being stopped at great cost. But Leviathan was nothing compared to what was coming now. The hive mind had sensed the Emperor's awakening. It had tasted the psychic power radiating from Terra. And it wanted more. Ships that were not truly ships moved through the darkness between stars. Billions of Tyranid organisms traveled in perfect harmony, guided by an intelligence that spanned the galaxy. They did not care about the war between order and chaos. They did not care about the great powers gathering for battle. They cared only about feeding. And Terra promised a feast beyond imagining. The Necrons emerged from tomb worlds that had slept for 60 million years. These ancient machines had ruled the galaxy before humanity existed. They had fought the old ones in wars that shattered stars. They had sold their souls to the Tan in exchange for bodies of living metal. Now they remembered something they had almost forgotten. Fear. The Silent King himself led the Necron forces. Zarek had once commanded the greatest empire in galactic history. He had made the terrible decision to transfer his people into metal bodies, destroying their souls in the process. He had wandered the void for millions of years, seeking a way to undo his mistake. And now he saw a being rising on Terra who might rival the Tan themselves that he did not know if he came as friend or enemy. He only knew that he had to be there when the Emperor rose. The fate of his entire race might depend on what happened next. The Eldar approached with their typical caution. The craft worlds had held council, their farser struggling to read a future that was changing too fast to follow. Some saw the Emperor's rise as salvation for the galaxy. Others saw the birth of a new god who would devour the souls of their dying race. They could not agree on what to do, so they did everything. Some craft worlds came to fight alongside the Imperium. Others came to fight against it. And some simply came to watch. The Dark Eldar of Comarak raided with desperate intensity. These twisted cousins of the craft world Eldar survived by feeding on the suffering of others. If the Emperor rose, his light might penetrate even their dark city. The tortures that sustained them might become impossible. They needed souls, as many as they could harvest, before the galaxy changed forever, the Tau observed from the edge of Imperial space. They were the youngest of the great powers, their empire tiny compared to the others. But they were practical above all else. They sent diplomats to seek alliance with whoever would listen. They prepared their most powerful weapons in case diplomacy failed. They did not understand the religious significance of what was happening, but they understood war. And war was clearly coming. Above Terra, the Imperial Navy gathered in numbers not seen since the Great Crusade. Ships from every sector had answered the call. Battle fleets that usually protected their own territories now defended the homeworld of humanity. Admiral Spire stood on the bridge of his flagship and looked at the forces arrayed against them. He had fought in dozens of campaigns. He had never seen anything like this. On the surface, the custodes prepared their final defense. Every warrior who could hold a weapon was called to duty. Pilgrims who had come to worship the Emperor were armed and trained in basic combat. Even the tech priests of the Mechanica mounted weapons on their many limbs. Terra would not fall without a fight, but the greatest danger came from within. The warp breach beneath the palace was growing. Demons clawed at the barrier between realities, sensing weakness. The Emperor's awakening was disturbing the balance that had held for 10,000 years. If he rose completely, he might seal the breach forever. Or he might tear it wide open. In the throne room, the custodes held their positions around their master. The Emperor's body was changing now. The withered flesh was filling out. The empty eye sockets glowed with inner light. Power radiated from him in waves that made even his guardians take steps back. Tribune Valoris watched and prayed. He had served the Emperor for thousands of years. He had thought he understood his master's will. Now he realized that he understood nothing. The being on the throne was becoming something new. Something that had never existed before. Something that might save humanity or destroy it. The forces of the galaxy closed in on Terra. In hours, the first shots would be fired. In days, the planet would be surrounded. And somewhere in the depths of the palace, a god was being born. On Makridge, in the fortress of the Ultramarines, Robot Guilliman stood alone in his private chambers. The Lord Commander of the Imperium and Primarch of the 13 Legion had returned to life centuries ago, brought back by Eldar technology and desperate need. Since then, he had worked without rest to hold the Imperium together. But tonight, something had changed. He felt his father. For the first time since his resurrection, the connection between them was clear. No longer was it a faint whisper lost in the noise of 10,000 years. Now it was a voice, strong and commanding, speaking directly into his mind. The words were not in any human language. They were pure meaning, pure intention, pure will. And they told him to come home. Guilliman walked to his window and looked out at the stars. He had thought himself alone among his brothers. The loyal Primarchs had either died or vanished during the dark years after the heresy. He had been the only one to return, carrying the burden of leadership on shoulders that were weary despite their superhuman strength. But the voice told him something else. He was not alone anymore. Deep beneath the rock, the mobile fortress monastery of the Dark Angels, something stirred in the most secret chamber. This place did not appear on any map. Its existence was known only to the Supreme Grand Master and the Watchers in the Dark. Here, in a tomb of black stone, lay the Lion L. Johnson, Primarch of the First Legion, had not died during the heresy. He had been wounded in his duel with the traitor Luther and had fallen into a sleep so deep that it resembled death. For 10,000 years, he had slumbered while his sons searched the galaxy for their fallen brothers. For 10,000 years, the Dark Angels had kept their shame secret. Now golden light penetrated even this darkness. It crept through stone and metal and void shields designed to hide this place from the eyes of gods. It touched the sleeping Primarch's face like a father's hand. And the lion opened his eyes that he rose from his tomb with a warrior's grace. His body was perfect, unmarked by the wounds that had laid him low. His armor was the same he had worn when he fell, black as midnight and trimmed with gold. His sword, the lion's sword, lay beside him, still sharp enough to cut reality itself. He took it in his hand and felt its familiar weight. The Watchers in the dark surrounded him. These mysterious creatures had guarded the lion since before the Emperor found him. They spoke in voices that only he could hear, telling him of the 10,000 years he had missed. They told him of the heresy's end. They told him of the Imperium's slow decay. They told him of the great rift and the galaxy torn in two. And they told him of his father's awakening. The lion's face showed no emotion. He had always been the most controlled of the Primarchs, the most difficult to read. But inside, something burned. His father was rising. His brothers were gathering. The final battle was coming. And he would not miss it. On the plains of Kagaris, the white scars gathered in numbers not seen since the Great Crusade. They had received word that could not be ignored. Their Primarch had returned. Jagatai Khan, the Warhawk, the master of the hunt, had emerged from the webway after 10,000 years. He rode into their camp on a bike that screamed with barely contained power. His white hair flowed behind him like a banner. His armor was scarred by battles fought in places that no human had ever seen. And his eyes held knowledge that would take centuries to share. The Khan had entered the webway to chase the Dark Eldar who had taken his people. He had thought it would be a short hunt. Instead, he had been trapped in the labyrinth dimension for millennia. He had seen things that challenged everything he knew. He had fought battles against enemies that made chaos look simple. And he had found his way home only because his father's light had shown him the path. From the Eye of Terror came Leman Russ. The Wolf King had left his legion after the heresy, promising to return for the Wolf Time, the final battle at the end of days. His sons had waited faithfully, keeping his throne empty, believing that one day he would come back. Now that day had arrived. Russ walked out of the warp storms on foot. His armor was gone, replaced by furs and leather that seemed to move on their own. His weapons were different too. The frost axe Mjalnar and the sword Krakenmaw were nowhere to be seen. Instead, he carried a spear that glowed with cold light, its blade carved from something that was not metal. He had found what he sought in the eye. He had found the weapon that could kill a god. On Nocturne, the salamanders received their father without surprise. Vulcan had died many times. He had been killed by his traitor brother Kurz over and over again. Each time, he had returned, for he was a perpetual, a being who could not truly die. But his deaths had damaged him. Each return had taken longer. Each recovery had been harder. Now, as the Emperor's power spread across the galaxy, Vulcan felt something change inside him. His perpetual nature was stabilizing. His connection to his father was strengthening. He would not die again. He would stand beside his brothers for the final war, and nothing in the galaxy would be able to stop him. 6 Primarchs walked the galaxy once more. Guilliman, the statesman. The lion, the general. The Khan, the hunter. Russ, the executioner. Vulcan, the immortal. And somewhere in the warp, others were stirring. Corax, the shadow. Dorn, the defender. Even those thought lost forever might return, but the traitors were gathering too. And the war between brothers that had begun 10,000 years ago was about to reach its conclusion. The sons of the Emperor were coming home. The question was whether home would survive their arrival. In the realm beyond reality, where thoughts became flesh and emotions shaped mountains, the impossible happened. The four great powers of chaos stopped their eternal war. They turned their attention to the material universe, to a single point of light that burned brighter than it had in 10,000 years. And for the first time since they rose to power, the dark gods felt something they had almost forgotten. They felt fear. Khorne sat upon his throne of skulls and watched. The blood god was rage-given form. He was the master of war and murder and hate. Nothing had ever made him pause his endless collection of skulls. But now he stared at the golden light spreading from Terra with eyes that burned like dying suns. His hand tightened on his sword until the weapon screamed. The Emperor had been strong once. Strong enough to hold back the tide of chaos for centuries. If he rose again, how much stronger would he be? In his crystalline fortress, Tzeentch laughed. The architect of fate found humor in everything, for everything was part of his grand design. But this laughter was different. It was the laughter of a schemer who had just discovered that someone else was playing a game he had not noticed. His 1,000 eyes blinked in patterns that his demons could not read. His plans, his beautiful infinite plans, suddenly had a flaw. The Emperor's awakening was not in any of his calculations. For the first time in eternity, Tzeentch faced the unknown. Nurgle's garden began to wilt at the edges. The Lord of Decay sat in his manse of rot and watched his precious plants turn brown. He loved all things equally, loved them as they grew and bloomed and died and returned to him. But hope was spreading through the galaxy, and hope was a poison he could not cure. Where his plagues brought despair, hope brought resistance. Where his gifts brought acceptance of death, hope brought the will to fight. His great belly shook with concern as he reached out to touch a dying flower. If the Emperor rose, how many souls would be lost to him? In palaces of pleasure and pain, Slaanesh stirred. The Dark Prince was the youngest of the four, born from the fall of the Eldar race. Excess and sensation were the domain of this god, and the Emperor had once stood against everything Slaanesh represented. The master of mankind had preached reason and order. He had tried to build a galaxy where humanity would not need gods. If he returned, he would remember that dream. He would try again. And this time, he might succeed. The four gods met in a place that existed between their realms. This had happened only once before, when Horus stood ready to slay his father. They had worked together then, pouring their power into the Warmaster to ensure the Emperor's fall. They had failed, but they had wounded him badly enough that he could not threaten them. Now they would have to work together again. Their conversation was not in words. It was in concepts and visions and raw power clashing against raw power. But if it could be translated into mortal speech, it would sound like this: the Emperor cannot be allowed to rise. We must stop him, or we will fall. I in the eye of terror, Abaddon the Despoiler felt the agreement of the gods like thunder in his skull. The Warmaster of Chaos stood aboard his flagship, the Vengeful Spirit, the same ship from which Horus had launched his final assault on Terra. Abaddon had led 13 Black Crusades against the Imperium. He had finally succeeded in his last attempt, tearing the galaxy in half with the cicatrix maledictum. He had thought himself close to final victory. Now he saw his error. Victory was not close at all. The real war had not yet begun. The visions the gods sent him showed Terra burning with golden fire. They showed the Emperor rising from his throne, no longer a withered corpse but something else entirely. They showed the final battle that would decide the fate of reality itself. Abaddon did not smile. He had not smiled in 10,000 years. But he felt something stir in his chest that might have been excitement. This was what he had been waiting for. This was the true long war. Not the endless skirmishes and crusades, but the final confrontation between the Emperor and Chaos. He began giving orders to gather his forces. The largest fleet the eye had ever seen would march on Terra. On the plague planet, Mortor Ion felt his father's awakening like a knife in his gut. The demon Primarch of the Death Guard had betrayed the Emperor during the heresy. He had given himself to Nurgle and become a prince of decay. For 10,000 years, he had spread plague across the galaxy, always telling himself that he had chosen the right side. Now doubt crept into his ancient heart. If his father rose again, would there be judgment? Would there be punishment? Or worse, would there be forgiveness? Magnus the Red sensed the change from his Tower of the Cyclops. The Crimson King had been the most loyal of sons once. His fall to chaos was a tragedy of good intentions gone wrong. He had only wanted to warn his father of Horus's betrayal. Instead, his warning had broken the Emperor's great work and doomed humanity's future. The guilt had never left him. And now, as he felt his father stirring, he wondered if this was his chance. Could he return to the Emperor's side? Could he undo 10,000 years of damnation? The warp storms that divided the galaxy began to shift. Navigators across every sector reported the same phenomenon. The cicatrix maledictum was moving. The great rift that had torn the Imperium in two was responding to the Emperor's awakening like a wound that sensed healing coming. Some storms grew stronger. Others faded entirely. New routes through the warp appeared where there had been nothing but madness before. On Holy Terra, the astronomers of the Imperial Palace watched their instruments with growing terror. The sky itself was changing. Stars that should have been visible were gone. Others had appeared where no stars should exist. The galaxy was responding to the Emperor's awakening, and nobody could predict what would happen next. The war for the galaxy was about to enter its final phase. The gods of chaos were moving. The traitor legions were gathering. And somewhere in the warp, things that had slept since before humanity existed were opening their eyes. The Emperor's awakening had done more than shake the Imperium. It had disturbed the very foundations of reality. Whatever came next would make the Horus heresy look like a minor disagreement. The true apocalypse was beginning, and the entire galaxy would burn before it was over. Deep beneath the Imperial Palace on Terra, in chambers that had not changed for 10,000 years, the golden light flickered. The Adeptus Custodes who stood guard noticed it first. These warriors had protected the Emperor since before the Horus heresy. They knew every hum of the ancient machines. They knew every whisper of the psychic winds that swirled around the golden throne. And they knew that something was wrong. Tribune Valorous walked through the corridors of the Sanctum Imperialis with purpose in his steps. The message had reached him only moments ago, delivered by a tech priest whose voice modulator could not hide his fear. The machines were behaving strangely. The readings made no sense. The Tribune had served for centuries, and he had never received such a summons. The throne room stretched before him like a cathedral of gold and shadow. Thousands of tech priests moved among the machinery, their mechadendrites plugged into systems that were older than most civilizations. The smell of incense mixed with the copper tang of recycled air. Candles burned in their millions, each one lit by a pilgrim who would never see this sacred place. And at the center of it all sat the Emperor. 10,000 years. That was how long the master of mankind had sat upon this throne. His body was little more than a skeleton wrapped in papery skin. Tubes and wires connected him to machines that kept his physical form from complete death. His eyes had long ago turned to dust, but still his psychic might blazed like a lighthouse in the warp. The Astronomicon, the beacon that made warp travel possible, existed only because of his sacrifice. Valorous approached the throne and knelt. He had done this countless times before. But today felt different. The air itself seemed to vibrate with tension. The tech priests had stopped their chanting. The custodes had tightened their grips on their guardian spears. Everyone was watching. Everyone was waiting. Then it happened. The Emperor's hand moved. It was not much. Just a twitch of fingers that had not stirred since Horus fell. Just a slight curl of joints that had been frozen in death's embrace. But in this place, where nothing ever changed, it was like watching a mountain move. Valorous felt his heart skip. Around him, tech priests fell to their knees. Some wept oil tears from mechanical eyes. Others began reciting prayers that had not been spoken since the Great Crusade. The Astronomicon flared. Where it had been a steady beacon, it now blazed with fury that could be felt across the galaxy. On 1,000 worlds, navigators screamed as the light burned their third eyes. Astropaths collapsed as their minds were overwhelmed by psychic energy beyond anything they had trained to receive. Ships in the warp were thrown off course as the light that guided them suddenly became a storm. On Titan, the fortress monastery of the Grey Knights shook to its foundations. These were the Emperor's secret weapon against the forces of chaos. They were the purest warriors humanity had ever created. And they were falling. Brother Captain Stern grabbed a pillar as the floor bucked beneath him. Around him, his battle brothers collapsed. The strongest psychers in the Imperium were being brought low by something they could not understand. Chief Librarian Voldus was the last to fall. He fought against the vision that tried to claim him, but in the end, even his will was not enough. The vision took him completely. He saw golden light spreading across the galaxy like dawn breaking after an endless night. He saw worlds bathed in radiance that drove back the darkness of the warp. But he also saw fire. He saw planets burning. He saw armies clashing in numbers beyond counting. He saw the death of everything, and the birth of something new. When he woke, his brothers were gathered around him. Their faces were pale beneath their psychic hoods. They had all seen something, though none had seen as much as Voldus. He spoke only 2 words before passing out again. He wakes. Across the Imperium, the effects spread like ripples in a pond. On hive worlds where billions lived stacked upon billions, people stopped their work and looked up. They did not know why. They only knew that something had changed. In manufactorums and mines, in temples and prisons, humanity paused. Some fell to their knees in prayer. Others wept without understanding why. Children born in that moment were marked by fate in ways that would not become clear for years. The Inquisition noticed immediately. They had agents everywhere, and those agents began sending reports that made no sense. Mass hysteria was spreading, but it was not the hysteria of fear. It was something else. People were speaking of hope. In an Imperium built on suffering and sacrifice, hope was perhaps the most dangerous thing of all. Inquisitor Greyfax read the reports in her quarters aboard her black ship. She had hunted heretics for centuries. She had seen cults rise and fall. She had witnessed demonic incursions that would drive lesser minds to madness. But this was different. This was not the work of chaos. This was something else entirely. And that terrified her more than any demon ever could. Back on Terra, Valoris still knelt before the throne. The Emperor's hand had grown still again, but the damage was done. The machines around the throne were displaying readings that the tech priests could not interpret. Ancient systems that had been dormant since the heresy were activating. Power was building in conduits that had not carried current for 10 millennia. The tribune rose to his feet and turned to face the assembled masses. Custodes, tech priests, servants, and scribes all waited for his words. He was the captain general of the Adeptus Custodes. He was the voice of the Emperor's will. And for the first time in his long life, he did not know what to say. That he looked back at the withered figure on the throne. Was this the end they had always feared? Was the Emperor finally dying? Or was this something else? The question burned in his mind as he gave the only order he could. Seal the palace. No one enters. No one leaves. And pray to the Emperor that we survive what comes next. The great doors began to close, shutting out the galaxy. But whatever was happening could not be contained by doors or walls. The Emperor was changing, and the entire galaxy would change with him.